Snow fell the way it always did out here, slow at first, almost gentle, as if the sky were thinking twice. Elias Crow stood just inside the mouth of the cave and watched it drift down, each flake catching what little light there was before vanishing against stone. People in town said a man couldn't live where sunlight hesitated. They said the cave swallowed warmth and sense alike. But Elias knew better. Stone remembered heat. Stone kept secrets. Stone didn't judge. Inside, the cabin breathed softly. Firelight trembled against rough rock walls, turning shadows into long, patient companions. The smell of pine resin and old wood clung to the air. Elias moved slowly, deliberately, the way a man does when time is the only thing he owns. He checked the chimney he'd carved himself years ago, ran his hand along the stacked firewood, counted jars by touch more than sight. He had learned to prepare early, learned to listen when the wind spoke in low warnings. Winter always announced itself to those willing to hear. In town, they never listened to him. They barely listened at all. Once a month, Elias made the walk down from the hills. The same boots, patched and resoled more times than he could remember, carried him past the first houses, past the hitching posts and the muddy street that never quite froze solid. Conversations slowed when he appeared. Laughter bent sideways. Children were pulled closer by their mothers, hands tightening at small shoulders. "That's him," Martha Bell would whisper, never quietly enough. "The caveman." They said he talked to bats. That he slept on bones. That something had broken in him years ago and never been fixed. Sheriff Thomas Hale watched him from the porch of the office, fingers hooked in his belt, eyes narrowed, not cruel, just careful. Elias met no one's gaze. He never argued. Shame had taught him early that silence was safer. He bought flour, beans, lamp oil. He nodded once to Jonah Whitlock at the counter and left before anyone could ask him anything. Outside, the wind already felt sharper than it should have been for that time of year. It slipped under coats and into thoughts. Elias paused, looking toward the low, swollen sky, and felt that old tightening in his chest. This one would be bad. Clara Whitmore watched him go. She stood at the back of the general store, chalk dust still faint on her fingers from the schoolhouse. The children had been restless all day, sensing change the way animals did. She had heard the whispers too, everyone had, but seeing Elias was different from hearing about him. He wasn't monstrous. He wasn't wild. He moved like a man who had learned how to take up less space than his body required. Clara knew something about that. Widowhood had thinned her in places no one could see. The town treated her gently, which somehow hurt more. Voices softened around her. Offers came too quickly. Pity followed her like a second shadow. She smiled when expected, taught her lessons, went home to a house that still remembered another heartbeat. At night, the walls creaked and she pretended it was conversation. When she heard Martha Bell's voice, sharp as frost, she felt something stir that surprised her. Not fear. Something closer to anger. That evening, snow began to fall in earnest. By morning, it did not stop. The first day passed quietly enough. Bells were rung, animals brought in, fires stoked higher. People joked about being snowed in. Elias did not joke. He hauled more wood inside, sealed gaps with old cloth and clay, and listened to the cave hum as the temperature dropped outside. Wind pressed hard against the mountain, testing it. The cave held. On the second day, roads disappeared. Fences vanished. The world narrowed to what could be seen from a doorway, and even that felt like a risk. In town, laughter faded. Clara stood at her window and watched white pile upon white until the horizon dissolved. Her fire burned low faster than it should have. She wrapped herself in a shawl and thought of how alone a house could feel when the world grew quiet. Up on the ridge, Elias stood at the cave's edge and looked down toward town, the way he always did when weather turned dangerous. He had survived storms like this before, storms that taught him the value of patience and the cost of pride. He thought of the people below, huddled together, and felt the old ache rise. They had never wanted him among them. That didn't mean he wanted them harmed. On the third day, hunger arrived. Not desperation yet, but its shadow. Fires went out in 2 homes when chimneys clogged. A calf froze where it stood. Someone knocked on the sheriff's door at dawn, eyes wide with something close to fear. Still, no one spoke Elias's name aloud. Clara made a decision that afternoon. She wrapped bread and dried apples in cloth, pulled on her coat, and stepped into the snow. The wind bit hard, stealing breath, but she kept going, following a narrow path she'd noticed once before, half rumor, half instinct. Her feet burned. Her fingers went numb. When she reached the place where rock curved inward and shadow deepened, she hesitated only a moment. She left the bundle where it could be found, and turned back without looking behind her. Elias found it near dusk. He stood still for a long time, staring at the cloth as if it might vanish. No trap. No message. Just food. His chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with cold. He carried it inside and sat with it beside the fire, unsure what to do with a kindness he hadn't earned, or at least, hadn't been allowed to earn. The next morning, he left something in return. A small bird, carved from scrap wood, its wings rough but careful. He set it where the bundle had been and walked away before anyone could see him. Snow kept falling. By the 4th day, the wind howled like an animal in pain. Doors drifted shut. Windows iced over. Clara's fire sputtered dangerously low. She sat wrapped in blankets, clutching the wooden bird in her hand, tracing its shape with her thumb. She thought of the cave, of warmth held inside stone, and wondered why people were so afraid of places that could save them. Up above, Elias reinforced his door and listened to the mountain groan. He knew this storm. He had seen its like before. 5 days, maybe more. The town was not ready. He stood at the cave mouth one last time before sealing it tight, snow swirling around him, and felt a choice settle heavy in his bones. The world outside disappeared into white. And somewhere below, a town that had never believed in him was running out of time. The weeks following the ball unfolded with a peculiar restraint, as though the household itself were holding its breath. The Duchess settled into Ashcombe House with quiet diligence, rising early, learning the rhythms of the estate, and presenting herself each day with measured calm. She neither complained nor retreated, for she understood that visibility, not absence, would determine her fate. What unsettled her was not the Duke's formality, which she respected, but the small, unexpected attentions that began to appear between silences. They arrived without announcement and without explanation, leaving her uncertain how to receive them. One morning, she found a volume of poetry placed upon the writing desk in her sitting room, its pages marked with a ribbon at a passage contemplating endurance rather than love. The hand was his, unmistakable in its precise script, yet no note accompanied the book. Later that same week, as she paused beside an open window to watch the mist lift from the lawns, a shawl was laid gently across her shoulders. She turned in surprise, but the Duke had already stepped away, his expression composed, his gesture complete. Such moments, trivial in isolation, gathered weight through repetition. They were not tender enough to be called affection, yet they exceeded what duty strictly required. The Duchess found herself caught between gratitude and caution, uncertain whether these offerings were meant to soothe her, or to ease his conscience. Society, however, interpreted them with far greater enthusiasm. Whispers crept through drawing rooms and along carriage paths, transforming modest gestures into proof of intimacy. A duchess ignored could be pitied, but a duchess privately favored became an object of fascination. Ladies who had once measured her worth now sought her confidence, hoping to extract secrets she did not possess. She answered with careful vagueness, guarding both her dignity and the Duke's privacy. Yet the very act of restraint only sharpened speculation. Matters worsened when she was seated beside him at a formal dinner, a placement arranged by the Duke himself. The gesture was simple, even practical, yet it ignited an avalanche of conjecture. Across the table, an ambitious marchioness observed them with narrowed eyes, her smile sharpened by calculation. By the following morning, a rumor had reached the Duchess suggesting that her influence over her husband was already being remarked upon at court. The notion unsettled her deeply, for influence was power, and power wielded by a woman invited resentment. She confronted the Duke that evening, not with accusation, but with composed inquiry. He listened without interruption, then replied that he had merely acted as courtesy dictated. If society misread his intentions, that, he said, was beyond his control. His calm response frustrated her more than anger would have. She realized then that his gestures, though genuine, were governed by habit rather than awareness of consequence. The Duke, accustomed to deference, underestimated the violence of rumor. Within days, a sharper tale emerged, one suggesting that the Duchess was positioning herself for influence over estates and succession. The implication wounded her pride, for ambition had never guided her conduct. She considered withdrawing to the countryside, where scrutiny might soften into distance. Before she could voice the thought, she received word that such a retreat was already being discussed among the Duke's relations. The decision, she understood, would not be hers alone. That evening, she attended a small gathering where the Duke, at last, addressed her directly in company. He spoke her name with deliberation, asked after her comfort, and listened as she replied. The exchange was brief, yet unmistakable. Around them, the room stilled, as though society itself leaned closer. Later, as they departed separately, the Duchess sensed that the balance had shifted. She was no longer merely enduring his distance, but navigating the consequences of his attention. The realization brought neither triumph nor comfort, only a sober awareness that the path ahead had narrowed. As she retired that night, the Duchess understood that restraint alone would no longer protect her. Something would soon demand a choice, and she feared it would come before she was ready. Beyond the windows, London settled into darkness, unaware that a quiet struggle had begun within one of its grandest houses. The Duke lingered in his study long after midnight, rereading correspondence he did not absorb. His thoughts returned, unbidden, to his wife's composure and the restraint with which she bore each rumor. He had believed kindness sufficient, never suspecting that kindness, unanchored by clarity, could wound as deeply as neglect. For the first time since his remarriage, doubt unsettled his confidence. He wondered whether his silence had protected them both, or merely postponed a reckoning. The thought followed him into uneasy sleep, as persistent as the rumors spreading beyond his control. Morning would bring decorum once more, but beneath it, tension gathered like a storm restrained by etiquette alone. Both husband and wife sensed that the careful distance between them was becoming impossible to maintain. What had begun as courtesy was evolving into consequence, and neither yet knew how to retreat without cost. The Duchess rose the next day with resolve tempered by caution, aware that her every action now carried weight. She would not flee, nor would she grasp at influence she had not sought. Instead, she prepared herself to meet whatever test society or marriage set before her with steady grace. In doing so, she stepped unknowingly toward a moment that would demand more than endurance. The quiet season of gestures and whispers was drawing to its end, and confession loomed beyond it. Neither love nor duty could remain undefined for much longer. Something must soon be spoken aloud, and when it was, the careful balance they preserved would inevitably shatter. Until that hour arrived, they moved forward separately, bound together by expectation, misunderstanding, and a fate neither could yet escape. The Duchess sensed it in the stillness, and did not know whether to dread or welcome what followed. That uncertainty followed her closely, darkening each measured step. The reckoning arrived without ceremony, carried not by scandal but by silence that had grown too heavy to bear. It was late evening when the Duchess entered the library, drawn there by a restlessness she could no longer master. The room was lit by a single fire and 2 lamps, their glow catching the gilt on the spines of books that had witnessed generations of restraint. The Duke stood near the mantel, one hand resting against the carved stone, his coat unbuttoned in a rare sign of fatigue. He turned as she entered, surprise flickering briefly across his features before composure reclaimed its place. Neither spoke at once. The quiet between them was no longer empty. It was crowded with unspoken sentences, withheld explanations, and the slow erosion of patience. She crossed the room and stood opposite him, her posture formal but her eyes steady. When she finally spoke, her voice carried neither accusation nor plea, only a clarity sharpened by weeks of endurance. She told him she would not continue as a subject of rumor, nor as an ornament misunderstood by society because her husband refused to define his intentions. She reminded him that she had accepted his honesty on their wedding night without protest, yet honesty, she said, required consistency. To offer gestures without meaning was not kindness but confusion. The Duke listened, his expression unreadable, yet something tightened in his gaze. He had expected reproach, perhaps resentment, but not this measured resolve. When she finished, she did not wait for reassurance. She simply stated that if he wished her to withdraw from public life, she would do so with dignity. If he wished her to remain, then clarity must replace silence. The choice, she said, belonged to him, but she would no longer exist in uncertainty. Her words unsettled him more deeply than any public scandal could have. 4 years, he had governed estates, settled disputes, and borne grief with controlled precision. Yet this quiet confrontation stripped him of familiar defenses. He confessed then, not with eloquence but with reluctant candor, that he feared naming emotions he did not yet trust. His first marriage had been marked by affection that grew too quickly and ended too absolutely. In its aftermath, he had mistaken restraint for safety. He admitted that his gestures toward her were genuine, but unexamined, born of respect and something he had not permitted himself to define. She received this confession without triumph. Instead, she asked him a single question, spoken softly but with unyielding weight, whether he believed she deserved a life shaped by hesitation alone. The Duke found no immediate answer. In that pause, she understood that whatever feeling stirred within him, it had not yet matured into courage. She turned then to leave, not in anger but in acceptance. As her hand touched the door, he spoke her name, not as a title, but as a plea restrained by pride. He told her he did not wish her absence, yet could not promise what he did not fully comprehend. She faced him once more, her expression calm but resolute. She replied that she would not ask for love, but neither would she accept perpetual doubt. With that, she withdrew, leaving the room altered by what had been spoken. Alone, the Duke remained by the dying fire, unsettled by the realization that his silence had cost him authority over his own household. He recognized, perhaps for the first time, that his wife's dignity was not passive but chosen, and that her willingness to endure had masked a strength he had underestimated. The thought troubled him, not because it threatened his position, but because it demanded a response he had long avoided. In the days that followed, their interactions became more deliberate, stripped of ambiguous courtesy. He did not offer books or silent gestures. She did not seek reassurance through proximity. Instead, they spoke when necessary and withdrew when conversation risked false comfort. Society noticed the change and misread it as cooling affection, unaware that something more consequential was taking shape beneath the surface. The Duchess, meanwhile, felt an unexpected lightness amid the uncertainty. By naming her boundaries, she had reclaimed a measure of agency denied to her since marriage. She understood now that endurance without voice had only prolonged her discomfort. Whatever future awaited her, it would be met on terms she had defined. One evening, as she prepared correspondence in her sitting room, a letter arrived in the Duke's hand. It was brief, requesting her presence the following afternoon for a matter of shared concern. The wording was formal, yet beneath it lay an unfamiliar urgency. She folded the letter carefully, sensing that the conversation they had begun in the library had not yet reached its conclusion. As night settled over the house, both husband and wife lay wakeful, aware that their carefully maintained distance had been irrevocably altered. What had once been endured in silence now demanded decision. The Duchess did not know whether the path ahead would lead toward union or separation, but she knew it would no longer be defined by ambiguity. The Duke, for his part, confronted a truth long deferred, that to preserve control over his life, he must risk the vulnerability he feared most. Between them stretched a future uncharted, shaped not by duty alone, but by the courage to speak what duty had long concealed. The next meeting would determine whether restraint would harden into distance, or give way to something neither had yet dared to name. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows of the withdrawing room when the Duchess entered, carrying with her a composure sharpened by resolve rather than hope. The Duke was already there, standing beside a table upon which lay several sealed documents, untouched tea, and a small velvet box. He turned as she approached, and in his expression she saw not hesitation, but decision. The silence that greeted her was different from those before it, no longer evasive, but deliberate, as though both understood that whatever was spoken now would shape the remainder of their lives. He began without preamble, telling her that the rumors had reached the highest circles, and that his silence had been interpreted as weakness or calculation. He admitted that he had underestimated both society's cruelty and her endurance. The confession cost him visible effort, yet his voice remained steady. He said that in seeking to preserve control over his grief, he had surrendered authority over his present. His restraint, once a shield, had become a wound inflicted not only upon her, but upon himself. She listened without interruption, her gaze fixed not upon the papers or the room, but upon the man before her. When he spoke of his late wife, his tone softened, not with longing, but with reverence tempered by time. He told her that love, as he had known it, had been sudden and consuming, and that its loss had taught him to distrust emotion itself. In marrying again, he had believed duty sufficient. He now understood that duty without truth was merely another form of evasion. The Duchess replied with measured calm, acknowledging his grief without surrendering her own. She told him she had never sought to replace a memory, nor compete with a past shaped by loss. What she had sought was honesty and intention. She reminded him that she had entered the marriage aware of its terms, yet those terms had shifted as gestures replaced words and silence invited judgment. Dignity, she said, could endure many things, but not perpetual uncertainty. The Duke moved then toward the table and opened the velvet box. Inside lay a simple ring, distinct from her wedding band, unadorned and deliberate in its design. He explained that it had belonged to his mother, given not at marriage, but years later, when affection had matured into choice. He offered it now not as a symbol of passion, but of intention. He told her that he could not promise love born of sudden fire, but he could promise devotion shaped by respect, honesty, and the willingness to grow beyond fear. For a moment, the Duchess did not respond. She regarded the ring not as a gift, but as a question. When she finally spoke, her voice carried quiet authority. She said that intention, once offered, demanded courage to sustain it. She would accept his promise, she told him, not as surrender, but as partnership. Yet she would not accept retreat. If he chose this path, it must be walked openly, before society and within the privacy of their home alike. The Duke inclined his head, acknowledging the condition without resistance. In that gesture, she saw the man he might yet become, not ruled by loss, but guided by resolve. He took the ring from its place and held it out to her. She extended her hand, not trembling, and allowed him to place it upon her finger. The contact was brief, restrained, yet charged with significance greater than any hurried embrace. That evening, they appeared together at a small gathering hosted within their own house. It was not a grand declaration, but a measured one. The Duke offered his arm, and the Duchess accepted without hesitation. They moved through the room as equals, their unity unmistakable. When a pointed remark was made regarding her influence, the Duke responded calmly, affirming his confidence in his wife's judgment. The words were simple, but their effect immediate. Whispers shifted, curiosity softened into respect, and the narrative began, subtly, to change. Later, in the quiet of their private rooms, they spoke not of love, but of plans, responsibilities, and shared expectations. The conversation lacked drama, yet it carried a weight that neither ignored. In choosing clarity, they had chosen consequence. The Duchess understood that affection, if it came, would arrive gradually, earned through trust rather than demanded by title. As night settled over the house, she stood by the window and considered the path that had brought her there. She was still a woman bound by duty, still subject to society's gaze, yet she was no longer diminished by silence. The Duke joined her, standing at a respectful distance, and together they regarded the darkness beyond the glass. Nothing was resolved beyond repair, yet something essential had been secured. In the days that followed, society would test their resolve, and habit would resist change. But within that room, Beneath that quiet sky, an understanding had been forged not by passion, but by choice. It was enough, for now, to endure.